ideal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us. We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB+ radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Inflation down a little, but still relatively high. This in the context of sclerotic GDP growth and international comparisons. Today we'll be exploring the state of the UK economy and looking ahead to Prime Minister's Questions, where Rishi Sunak will face down Sir Keir Starmer. All that after the headlines.
Tom, thank you. Good morning. It's just gone 9:30. I'm Bethany Elsey in the GB newsroom. The rate at which prices are rising has slowed for the second month in a row, but the cost of some food has hit a 45-year high. Figures from the Office for National Statistics said the rate of inflation fell to 10.5% in December. That's down from 10.7% the month before. It says falling fuel costs were largely behind the slowdown, with average petrol prices down by 8.3% a litre since last month. But rising food costs and restaurant prices kept the rate higher. Chancellor Jeremy Hunt says there's still a long way to go.
Any country anywhere in the world with inflation over 10% is seeing it at frankly dangerous levels for the stability of an economy. But for families up and down the country, they are seeing food price inflation of nearly 17%, and that's causing a massive hike in the cost of the weekly shop. And what that really shows is that for us and for other countries, the most important thing is to stick to a plan to bring down inflation.
Thousands of nurses from more than 55 NHS trusts in England are staging a two-day strike in a dispute over pay and patient safety. The action by members of the Royal College of Nursing is expected to lead to thousands of operations and appointments being cancelled. The Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, says he wants to work with unions to find a fair resolution, but warned unaffordable pay rises will stoke inflation. Ukraine's interior minister is among at least 16 people who've been killed in a helicopter crash. The national police chief says Denis Monastyrsky was killed in the crash near a nursery in the town of Brovary outside Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. The cause is unknown and there's been no immediate comment from Russia. The man arrested on suspicion of attempted murder following a drive-by shooting outside a church in central London has been released on bail. The incident left 6 people injured, including a 7-year-old girl who remains in a serious but stable condition in hospital. The Metropolitan Police say shotgun pellets were fired from a moving black Toyota on Saturday afternoon as mourners left a funeral service. You're up to date on TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Now it's back to the briefing.
Good morning, it's 9:33 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, the Office for National Statistics has this morning released the latest inflation figures, of course, as we just heard in the news. The CPI, the Consumer Price Index, was at 10.5%, down marginally from 10.7%, but still, of course, in double figures. This morning, the Chancellor addressed that figure. Let's listen in to what he had to say.
Well, what these figures show is that there is still a long way to go in the battle against inflation. Any country anywhere in the world with inflation over 10% is seeing it at frankly dangerous levels for the stability of an economy. But for families up and down the country, they are seeing food price inflation of nearly 17%, and that's causing a massive hike in the cost of the weekly shop. And what that really shows is that for us and for other countries, the most important thing is to stick to a plan to bring down inflation. The Prime Minister said that he wants to halve inflation in the coming year, and for families and businesses, it's absolutely essential that we stick to that plan.
Chancellor Jeremy Hunt speaking this morning. Well, our economics and business editor Liam Halligan joins me now in the studio to break down what he's saying. Is he right? Is inflation really on track to halve in the next year?
I think it will, because I think that global energy prices are falling. I think a lot of the supply chain issues, the post-lockdown lingering difficulty that many countries have of producing stuff and services, which the Chancellor rightly referred to, I think those are receding. Those supply chain knots are definitely easing. But today's number is a disappointment. The CPI was still 10.5% higher in December 2022 than it was in the same month the year before. In the US, inflation is now down at 6.2%, much lower, which is why a lot of people think the Federal Reserve, their big central bank, the most important central bank in the world, will now start raising interest rates, but by less, smaller increases in response to this disappointingly small drop in inflation this morning. On the one hand, this isn't going to ease industrial relations at all. We can talk about that. But when it comes to the Bank of England and interest rates, so important for savers, but also borrowers, mortgage holders, I reckon when the Bank of England next meets to set rates on Thursday, the 2nd of February, there was hope there'd just be a quarter-point rise, a much smaller one, because inflation seems to have peaked. But because inflation's coming down slower than a lot of people expected, we could see another hefty half-point, 0.5 percentage point interest rate rise.
To some extent, a lot of criticism of the Bank of England for not going as early as the Federal Reserve did in the United States and not going as far.
Some of us were saying well over a year ago, Tom, as you know, that inflation was going to be very, very serious. And we were derided when we said the idea that this inflation would be transitory was not true. It strikes me also that this industrial action, the biggest wave of industrial action we've had since the 1970s, there was a sense that the government could say, look, inflation's falling, you don't need, a double-digit pay rise. But, we're still in double digits.
Yes.
So the Labour Party, the trade unions have been out immediately after this number saying, of course you need these big, hefty double-digit rises. And what the Chancellor was trying to say in that film, in fact, I didn't think he quite got to the nub of the problem. What you've got to convince the public of is that if the public sector awards massive double-digit pay rises, that won't only mean more taxes, more borrowing, which is inflationary, that increases firms' costs, the government's interest rate payments and so on. It will also be copied across the rest of the economy because the 4/5 of us in the private sector will start demanding those
up. And the
massive
private sector pay rises have been much less than double figures.
Well, it's complicated, but the point is that if you have big rises across the private sector, firms have to pass a big chunk of that higher wage bill on, which then leads to higher prices for goods and services, which then leads to higher wage demands. We get a 1970s-style wage price spiral. This is not an academic theory. This is what often happens when you get rising industrial strife. And I think today's interest rates number, today's inflation number and the prospect of higher interest rates and indeed the continued cost of living squeeze will mean that the industrial action that we thought would ease could remain pretty tough.
That's a really stark assessment. But let's look at some more of the communication that the Chancellor has been putting across this morning. Not only a piece to camera in the Treasury, but also a quirky little video in a coffee shop where he explores what he says are the big drivers of inflation. Let's take a little look.
There are lots of reasons why inflation has risen. One of them is COVID. When we found a vaccine and came out of lockdown, global supply chains struggled to cope, and that pushed prices up. Another is Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which pushed global gas prices to their highest ever levels. And finally, even after gas prices have started to come down, economists say that energy prices will remain high for some time. And all that means that the price of a cup of coffee has gone up.
Well, looking there at the prices of a cup of coffee, it's a relatable thing, but it's interesting. The three things that the Chancellor said were COVID, were the war in Ukraine, and were energy prices, I suppose, linked to the first two. But he didn't mention government borrowing, and he didn't mention the Bank of England printing a lot of money. Should he?
Yeah, there was a lot of sort of rhetorical sleight of hand in what he said. I mean, you and I know more than anyone, Tom, how difficult it is to talk about complex things in small amounts of time, right? I mean, that's what I'm doing now and what you're doing now, of course. He says, oh, global energy prices are coming down. Absolutely. The gas price in European wholesale markets now is 55 euros per megawatt hour, down from 350 euros back
it's about
in
the
August.
level before it was when Russia invaded.
And 150 euros in December. So it's coming down very... Still high by historic standards, but you're right, below where it was in the months immediately before Putin invaded Ukraine. And then he says, oh, but economists say energy prices that you pay will stay high. Well, you can't wish that away, Charles. All right, you know, where's Ofgem making sure that these energy wholesale price reductions are being passed on to consumers? You know, where is some kind of government minister saying to the petrol retailers, look, what's happened to oil prices? They're way below where they were before Putin invaded, and yet petrol prices are higher and diesel prices are higher still. So I had that issue with that little video. Yes. But I also, like you, thought it was a huge omission to not talk about quantitative easing, an issue I've been talking about for many, many years. I do think this massive increase in the money supply, the Bank of England expanding its balance sheet, basically creating money from nowhere, not printing physical notes, but creating money, the Bank of England's own balances, using it to buy government bonds, that money going into the economy. Before COVID, a lot of that quantitative easing stayed within the financial system, and that meant that stocks and shares went up, house prices went up, particularly at the sort of upper end where lots of financial people were buying upmarket houses. The difference between pre-COVID era quantitative easing and post-COVID era quantitative easing, and we did more quantitative easing in the 2 years of lockdown than we did in the 10 years leading up to lockdown. But it's different because that COVID era quantitative easing, it went directly to firms to pay for furlough and households for business support loans and so on, and higher benefit payments, and so that money...
So it's sloshed around the real economy.
It doesn't stay inside the banking system, it doesn't stay inside the financial system, it's gone straight into the bank balances of firms and households.
And as the former governor...
As it's spent, it will prove to be inflationary.
As the former governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, said just a few weeks ago, you had too much money chasing too few goods as a result of that. I mean, will the Chancellor ever accept this?
No, of course he won't, not while he's Chancellor, because quantitative easing was, in effect, a very, very political thing, and it does really challenge the idea that the Bank of England is independent, rather than just creating money to get a government in a tight corner off the hook. Look, you have to take my word for this. There was a major House of Lords inquiry, which admittedly I gave evidence to, but that was chaired by Michael Forsyth, Lord Forsyth, the former cabinet minister. But people on that committee included the likes of Mervyn King, the likes of Robert Lord Skidelsky, some very serious economic thinkers, some world-class economists, and they call quantitative easing a dangerous addiction. Wow. And they talked about the fact that it's challenging the independence of the Bank of England and that we will live to regret it. I do think there's a lot of inflation in the system because of QE, but I must say I did expect this number today, 10.5%, to be slightly lower. I'm surprised, given this massive fall in energy prices, that inflation for now is proving so sticky.
Well, Liam, thank you so much for your analysis. Really appreciate it this morning, making sense of these very complicated issues. Well, with that concerning economic news, let's widen our scope now and explore how the UK is comparing to European nations. Of course, last week I sat down with Jacob Rees-Mogg and we touched on this subject during that conversation. Let's remind ourselves.
Actually, the UK's economic performance compared to other European countries is remarkably good. And you should interview Julian Jessup, who's absolutely excellent on this and has all the details at his fingertips.
Well, Jacob Rees-Mogg said that we should interview Julian Jessup on this with all the details at his fingertips, and that is exactly what we intend to do today. Of course, that full interview with Jacob Rees-Mogg is available on the GB News YouTube channel, but let's heed the former Business Secretary's advice right now. I'm delighted to be joined by Julian Jessup on the briefing this morning. Julian, thank you for joining us. Let's dive in, first of all, to where the UK is in terms of growth compared to the EU, because there have been some assessments, most notably Mark Carney not so long ago, saying that the United Kingdom economy is massively down compared to where it would have been if it remained in the EU. In your view, is he right?
No, I think Mark Carney was completely wrong. And actually, a number of economists have criticised him, including some economists who are no fans of Brexit. He simply made some very basic mistakes in his economic analysis. If you look at the bigger picture, obviously, it depends where you start the clock. But if you start the clock from 2016, which was when the UK voted to leave the European Union, our growth rates since then have been pretty much the same as the other countries that are comparable to us in the rest of Europe. So we've done a little bit worse than France, but we've done about the same or better than Germany, Italy, and Spain. So there's no real evidence of major underperformance since then. And I also think it's revealing that people talking about Brexit being a disaster have to rely on two things. One is they rely on forecasts from other organisations for what might happen over the next 2, 3, 5 years. And forecasts, particularly by economists, are not really reliable, and they're sort of you forecast what you think will happen, not necessarily what is going to happen. The other problem is that they tend to rely very heavily on sort of very complicated, fancy models about what would have happened if we hadn't left the European Union, to come up with all sorts of scary numbers for how big the impact on the economy has been. But these, by and large, fail what I call a simple, smell test. I mean, suggestions that the economy now is already 5.5% smaller than it would have been if we hadn't left the EU. And that just simply doesn't stack up against the data about what has actually happened.
Well, let's look at one of your graphs now. This is UK GDP relative to German GDP growth. This goes up to November last year. It's interesting. Of course, we had a deeper COVID recession than Germany, but actually our bounce back has been more impressive.
Yes, and I think it's worth bearing in mind that there are good reasons why the UK economy might have been hit harder by COVID than some other economies. So, for example, we're more of the services-dependent economy, which is more vulnerable to the COVID restrictions, social distancing, and so on. We've also measured the impact of COVID more accurately, particularly the impact that it's had on public services, so things like health and education. So there are good reasons to have expected a bigger fall in GDP. And we've against that, we've also had a much stronger recovery than most people anticipated. A lot of gloomy surveys around at the beginning of this year, economists predicting that the UK would be, by far the worst performing economy over the next several years. But those same surveys a year or two ago were predicting the same thing. And in fact, our growth in 2022 was relatively strong. So I think it's important to step back a bit and look at the data and try and understand what's in there. For me, the big story is that actually our performance has been pretty similar to other countries. The similarities are far bigger than the differences, and that includes things like inflation, where our inflation picture has not been significantly different from Germany again in this case. So I don't think there's any sort of major UK specific factors can explain what's going on. It's more the impact of COVID, the energy crisis, and the differential impact that has had on different countries.
Yes, it's really frustrating that COVID struck just as the United Kingdom left the EU's single market. It muddies the water in so much of this analysis. But you mentioned inflation, and I believe we've got another of your graphs about food price inflation in particular, this from December last year, and it shows that the UK's inflation is really tracking exactly that of the euro area and the EU. Of course, US inflation is now considerably lower, and things have moved in the last month or so a little bit. But it is remarkable how similar the UK is behaving to all of these EU countries.
Well, exactly. That's the key point. People are always trying to explain these things by looking at Brexit. And again, there have been some quite fancy economic analysis suggesting that UK food prices are, say, 6% higher than they would otherwise have been as a result of Brexit. But then again, I just compared that with the actual data, which shows that the increase in food prices over the last few years have actually been smaller in the UK than they have in the rest of Europe on average. Now, as it happens, I'm not going to attribute that to Brexit and say that's a benefit of Brexit. I think there are other factors in there, including the fact that the pound has been reasonably firm against the euro, and that's been important. But the evidence that there's been a significant Brexit impact on things like food inflation is just as flimsy as that. For example, the impact that it might have been on the supply of labour or the overall economic performance of the economy.
Really interesting stuff there. I suppose the only downside is that because the Eurozone is performing so poorly, comparisons to the Eurozone might make the UK look like it's doing all right, but actually we're comparing ourselves to a part of the world that isn't having a particularly good time of it economically. And so perhaps we should be setting our sights a little bit higher than simply comparing ourselves to the continent. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for right now. If you have just one more sentence, that would be great.
Yeah, very, very briefly. So some sort of anti-Brexit economists therefore compare our performance with, for example, the US or Australia or Canada. But remember, those are major commodity producers, and energy in particular. So even without COVID, we still expect our economy to underperform against economies that are major producers and exporters of commodities.
Really, really interesting stuff. Well, let's hope that we can go beyond the European average in the years to come. For now, Julian Jessup, thank you so much for explaining all of that for us here on The Briefing this morning. Now, just finally today, of course, it is Prime Minister's Questions, and the Prime Minister will be facing down questions from the leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer. What will he go on? Will it be strikes? Will it potentially be Section 35? Might it be inflation? Well, I'm delighted to be joined by both Ben Glaze, the Deputy Political Editor of the Daily Mirror, and Sam Lister, the Political Editor of the Daily Express. Sam, if you were Sir Keir Starmer, what would you ask this afternoon?
It's tricky, isn't it? I think the Section 35 row, which relates to Westminster vetoing Scottish gender reform laws, I think that's a difficult one for Labour because Labour is in a bit of a mess on it. So Sir Keir Starmer doesn't have a clear position of where the party is. He's obviously got splits with Scotland, there's splits within the party, and I think that would be very difficult. But I think what you will see, obviously, is the SNP really gunning for the Prime Minister on this. So I think there could be quite a bit of fireworks in that regard. For Keir Starmer, again, strikes is also quite difficult because he's trying to look like a government in waiting. Yeah. He doesn't necessarily want to look like a rabble-rouser for trade unions, but also he's got to demonstrate that he is on the side of workers. So, again, it's quite a tricky position for him.
So it might be inflation that actually is the only thing that he can go on while sitting on the fence on the other issues.
I mean, this is the tricky thing, isn't it, when you're sitting on the fence? But, I mean, he could pick particular bits of the strike action that he feels more comfortable with. But clearly, probably inflation would be a bit of a kind of more neutral place for him to be.
Now, Ben Glaze, of course, on Monday we saw that the Conservative Party passed the first hurdle of their minimum service level legislation, what Labour are calling the Sack the Nurses Bill. I'm not sure that's quite stuck. Do you think that might be a point of discussion today?
Yeah, I think Keir Starmer will raise the nurses' strike, which is obviously taking place now, and another 12-hour strike tomorrow. That's safer ground for him when it comes to industrial action that's gripping the country at the moment. Because opinion polls do show that the country is still on the side of the nurses, whereas support for strikes in other sectors, particularly on the railways, has started to wane in recent weeks and months. But I think Keir Starmer is definitely going to highlight the fact that nurses in, I think, 55 NHS trusts in England, they're on picket lines today, and point to that the problem that highlights with the NHS in crisis. And, of course, you can then bring in today's inflation figures. You know, this very small drop in inflation, which is obviously good news, but it still means prices are 10.5% higher than they were 12 months ago. So you can tie that in to part of the reason that the industrial action is taking place, which, of course, the cost of living crisis.
Really interesting, because Rishi Sunak last week was seen to have had a bit of a win at Prime Minister's Questions in very tricky circumstances. That was surprising. Do you think we're going to see the same sort of passion from him perhaps today?
Yeah, I think Labour were quite struck, actually, by how Rishi Sunak did perform at the dispatch box last Wednesday. I was sat in the chamber watching from the press gallery, and there was a real energy about him. And often when Rishi Sunak does set-piece speeches, he's got this sort of rather patronising bedtime story voice. When he does question and answers and performs off the cuff, he's much, much better at it. And Labour are quite struck by that, and sometimes they're a little bit worried about how he's going to respond.
That's a really interesting point, Sam Minister, because we've learnt this week as well that the Prime Minister is going to start going on a tour of the country, an almost soapbox tour, the Prime Minister Connect, he's calling it. I suppose the team in Number 10 are looking at how he performs off the cuff and thinking, this is a lot better than him giving speeches.
Yeah, much better. And I think it's a bit Cameron-esque, isn't it? It's going back to the Cameroon days where you see David Cameron going into a workplace, taking questions. It's quite a clever strategy, though, if you do it like that, if he replicates the Cameron way. Because if you go into a workplace, it looks like you're taking questions from members of the public, but actually, which worker is ever really going to cause trouble when their bosses are watching? So you give this illusion of taking questions from the public, well, actually, everyone's on their best behaviour. So probably I would imagine he will do something along those lines rather than just going out into the street and being open to abuse.
I remember once Ed Miliband went to some sort of town square and got egged.
Yes, yeah.
And I think it was a BBC camera there that was asking people around, do you know who this man is?
Yeah.
And they're like, no. And they're like, he wants to be Prime Minister. And they're like, of here?
It's a risky strategy to just go out into the wild, as it were, and just speak to any kind of passerby, because you don't have that element of control. And actually, with Theresa May, I was once with her where she took a real kind of hammering while walking around a market, and it all just got quite difficult. And so I think Prime Ministers, they like to have a controlled environment. So I think you can see him doing these kind of events, but I think it will be tightly controlled.
And Ben, looking at this sort of soapbox-esque tour of the country, it's starting to feel like the general election campaign's already begun. Everyone's always in campaigning mode, aren't they? I think we've probably got 18 months until the next general election. But when Rishi Sunak came into Number 10, he sort of made it quite clear that, you know, we are preparing for the next general election. He's not going to be toppled as Conservative leader or indeed Prime Minister until that election. So, yeah, we are in the long campaign, if you like. So those strategies are being deployed already. And, yeah, this style of soapbox politics, I think, yeah, we will see that more and more in the run-up to autumn 2024 when we expect the next election to take place. Well, Ben and Sam, thank you so much for talking us through that. I suppose we'll listen very carefully at midday today to see if any of those electioneering slogans might pop from the Prime Minister's lips. That's it from us today. Coming up, it's Bev Turner today. Thanks for watching.
This year on GB News, we've got brand new members in the family.
Join us. Across the entire United Kingdom, we cover the issues that matter to you. GB News will always stay honest, balanced and fair. We want to hear whatever is on your mind.
And we don't talk down to you.
The establishment had their chance.
Now we're here to represent you.
Britain's watching.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight.